Hey everyone, Noah Zerby here. This is one of a series of short videos looking at the European Union in the context of international relations. This video examines the major institutional features of the EU. So let's get to it. The European Union is comprised of 6 primary institutions. The European Council is comprised of the heads of state or government of the member states of the EU. In theory, the Council represents the interests of the EU member states while providing direction and guidance for the EU. The European Council provides direct guidance to the Council of Ministers of the European Union, which is comprised of the 27 ministers, one per member state, with portfolios relevant to the issue under consideration. Because of this, and to avoid confusion with the European Council, this is sometimes called the Council of Ministers. Thus, if the Council is addressing questions of foreign policy, the foreign ministers of the member states will be represented. If it's debating agricultural policy, the ministers for agriculture will be present, and so on. The Council is supposed to ensure broad coordination of economic and social policy across the EU. The Council shares some broad budgetary and legislative powers with the European Parliament through a process called co-decision. We'll come back to that in another video. For now, just know that the European Parliament is the legislature of the European Union. It shares authority with the Council of Ministers while simultaneously representing the people of Europe in the European Union. The European Commission serves as the executive branch of the European Union. Headed by the Director General, the Commission has long been the primary proponent of Europe, going so far as to push member states towards greater integration. The European Commission submits draft legislation to Parliament and Council for consideration, implements policies, administers the budget, and negotiates international agreements on behalf of the Union. Historically, the center of power in the European Union was the Commission. The Lisbon Treaty took some steps towards limiting that power, but that said, it arguably remains the most powerful actor in the European Union. Headquartered in Frankfurt, the European Central Bank, or ECB, works with the national central banks of the member states to determine monetary policy in the Eurozone. Unlike the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States, which has a twin mission of maintaining price stability or preventing inflation and ensuring full employment or at least maintaining low rates of unemployment, the ECB's mission includes only price stability. The European Court of Justice, or formerly the Court of Justice of the European Union, is based in Luxembourg and is supposed to ensure the uniform application of justice and interpret laws across the European Union. The ECJ has the power to hear disputes involving member states or European institutions, as well as disputes between institutions, businesses, and individuals in the European Union. Unlike many international courts, the ECJ has compulsory jurisdiction, meaning that its decisions are binding on the member states of the European Union. It is also considered a court of last resort, meaning that it can hear appeals from national courts involving principles or obligations under European law. There are a number of specialized agencies operating under the auspices of the European Union. These include Europol, the European Police and Law Enforcement Agency, which coordinates the activities of member states, the Committee on Regions, which is comprised of elected representatives from the distinctive regions inside Europe and advises the EU on issues of concern to the regions, and the European Space Agency, among many others. Now, you might ask, where are the people of Europe? Even more so before the Lisbon Treaty was adopted, there were great concerns expressed about the democratic deficit in Europe. The argument was that the European Parliament had very little real power. The European Council had at best a second-order interest in representing the people of Europe, and so there was this sense that the institutions of the European Union were not directly accountable to the people of Europe, despite being increasingly responsible for drafting basic policy and key laws for the entire continent. To that end, the Lisbon Treaty strengthened the role of the European Parliament, which is intended to be the voice of the people in the EU. In reality, however, the influence of the Parliament remains relatively limited. It has the power to approve, reject, or amend legislative proposals brought to it by the Commission, but it does not have the power to draft legislation itself, unusual for a Parliament. We examine the legislative process itself in another video. 2 other powers of the Parliament are worth noting. First, Parliament approves appointments to the European Commission. However, appointments come as a slate, and the Parliament may only approve or reject the entire slate, effectively limiting this power. Second, through codecision with the Council, the Parliament approves the EU's budget and carries out oversight responsibilities. The parliament itself is comprised of 705 members elected to 5-year terms on a national basis through a system of proportional representation. Importantly, while the number of seats is assigned to each country on the basis of population, and the largest countries in the European Union thus have the most seats, the distribution seats is actually based on a system of digressive proportionality, meaning that the smallest states are overrepresented in parliament relative to the largest states. Germany, for example, has just under 81 million people and holds 96 seats in parliament, meaning that it has about 1 seat for every 843,000 inhabitants. Malta, by contrast, has a population of about 400,000 people and holds 6 seats in parliament, giving it 1 seat for every 70,000 people, or about 10 times the relative representation of Germany. As I just said, elections for the European Parliament take place at the national level, and seats are assigned on the basis of proportional representation. Thus, if a party gets, say, 10% of the vote in Germany, it would receive roughly 10% of the seats available to Germany in the European Parliament. Once elected, members of the European Parliament, or MEPs, sort themselves into groups based on party identity and philosophy rather than based on national identity. Thus, the members of the national parties sort themselves into a series of groups based on each party's political ideology and policy preferences. This is necessary because parties exist and compete at the national level rather than at the European-wide level. Groups also assign committee seats and provide access to state funding, so there's a practical reason to be a member of a group as well. Without group membership, MEPs cannot serve on any committees and cannot have access to EU funding. So let's take one example, the European People's Party Group, or EPP. This is the largest group in the European Parliament, with 186 MEPs from across the EU's 27 member states. It's an umbrella of representatives from almost 50 different political parties across Europe. It's a coalition of various Christian democratic parties, a number of conservative parties, and others with similar outlooks. The parties work together in groups in order to advance their shared agendas. Each group unites parties with a broadly similar political philosophy. In the case of the EPP, for example, parties of this group are broadly center-right and share philosophies that promote further European integration and are generally pro-social market. Groups must have at least 25 MEPs from at least 7 different European states and must share a common ideology. These requirements are intended to prevent extremist parties on either end of the political spectrum from gaining excess influence in the parliament. The most recent elections to the European Parliament were completed in 2019, meaning the next election is scheduled for 2024. Following the 2019 elections, the center-right European People's Party Group, or EPP, won the largest number of seats in Parliament. The EPP has representation from all 27 EU member states. The center-left Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats group received the second largest number of seats with 146 MEPs. Like the EPP, the S&D group is broadly supportive of continued European integration, though from a generally center-left perspective. In the early years of the European Parliament, it was almost always the largest group in the European Parliament, but since 1999, support for the S&D has slipped and now it's the second largest group. It currently has representation from 25 of the 27 EU member states. Together, the EPP and the S&D form a grand coalition to control the Parliament. The Renew Europe group is a new group of the European Parliament, replacing the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats for Europe, which ceased to exist in 2019. With 98 MEPs from 22 of the 27 EU member states, Renew Europe is the third largest group in Parliament. It's a centrist group that is broadly pro-European integration in its orientation. The Identity and Democracy group has 76 seats in Parliament, with representatives from 10 of the EU member states. It's a broadly right-wing nationalist and populist group opposing European integration and the EU's current immigration policies. Its base of support is strongest in Italy and France, with 52 of its MEPs coming from those two countries alone. The Greens and European Free Alliance group was created through the merger of 3 smaller party groups in 1999. It has 67 MEPs from 15 of the EU member states. The group is broadly pro-European integration, but is much more supportive of regional and minority rights than are the other pro-Europe groups in Parliament. As the group's name suggests, it also has a strong environmental focus. The ECR, or European Conservatives and Reformist Group, is a broadly center-right populist and Eurosceptic group, ideologically falling between the EPP and the ID groups. It currently has 62 MEPs from 16 different EU member states. The European United Left and Nordic Green Left, or GUE-NGL group, is comprised of left-wing populist groups, largely socialists and communists. It's difficult to place on the pro- or anti-European integration spectrum, as it's opposed to the current structure of the EU, but is broadly in favor of integration, just in a different form. The group currently has 29 MEPs from 13 EU member states, primarily in Western Europe. And finally, there are 29 MEPs who are not associated with any specific group. These MEPs are called non-inscrits, or NIs. Many of these are far-right nationalists who reject ID as being insufficiently Eurosceptic. It also includes communist groups that view the GUE and the S&D as being too mainstream. If we look at changes to the composition of groups in the European Parliament over time, something interesting jumps out. This graph shows the outcome of every European election since the first one in 1979. In the early years of the Parliament, the mainstream center-right and center-left groups did very well, but over time support for the mainstream pro-European parties began to decline. Support for those parties migrated to smaller parties, including the Greens and several Eurosceptic groups. Additionally, the number of NIs has increased over time. Moving on to the next institution, the European Commission. The Commission is intended to be the voice of integration for the European Union, representing the interests of the Union as a whole rather than the specific interests of European people or its constituent member states. Historically, the majority of power in the European Union was vested in the Commission. Even today, the Commission proposes new legislation and programs, implements decisions of the Council and the Parliament, manages the budget and the day-to-day affairs of the European Union, enforces regulatory policy, and represents the EU at international forums. The European Commission is comprised of 27 commissioners, one per member state. Commissioners take an oath to the European Union rather than to their home state. The Commission's president is selected first, proposed by the European Council, and confirmed by the Parliament. Once selected, the other members of the Commission are selected by agreement between the President and the Council, and the entire slate, referred to as a college, is approved by the Parliament. Similarly, the Parliament can censure or dismiss the Commission through a vote of no confidence, but cannot remove an individual member of the Commission. The Council and the Commission do have the power to remove individual commissioners for breach of obligation, but the Parliament cannot. There are actually few official requirements to serve as president, or for that matter as a commissioner. To be approved, the successful candidate generally needs to be a member of one of the parties that comprises the majority coalition in Parliament. By tradition, they must come from a state that is a member of the Eurozone and the Schengen Agreement. Unofficially, they must be proficient in French. Usually they've been selected from among the prominent national political leaders, but this is not a formal requirement. Several commissioners are selected to serve as vice presidents of the Commission, one of whom is designated the first vice president. The remainder are assigned specific portfolios, similar to the way executives at the national level are assigned, but usually with a more focused portfolio. Thus, there is a Commissioner for Justice and Consumers, a Commissioner for Digital Single Market, a Commissioner for Trade, a Commissioner for Youth and Education, and so on. It's perhaps easiest to think of commissioners as being roughly equivalent to cabinet secretaries in the US system. The functional work of the European Union is undertaken by a number of director generals, who are generally career civil servants with expertise in the relevant policy areas. Each Director General reports to a Commissioner who oversees a Directorate General, or DG. In total, there are some 32,000 professional civil servants working in the various DGs, and this is where the actual work of the Commission and much of the European Union is done. The Council of Ministers represents the voice of the European Union's member states. As previously noted, the Council is comprised of appropriate ministers of the member states with portfolios relevant to whatever issue is currently under consideration. Historically, the Council had primary legislative powers in key areas like taxation, common security and foreign policy, and so on. Over time, however, the scope of that power has been limited, and codecision with the Parliament has become the norm. Among its areas of responsibilities, the Council is charged with coordinating the economic and social policies of the member states in areas relevant to the European Union. The Council also approves international agreements signed by the Commission, and with Parliament approves the budget of the European Union. The presidency of the Council rotates among the member states, shifting every 6 months. Member states can use the presidency to focus on specific issues of international concern, such as British Prime Minister Tony Blair did when he focused on debt forgiveness for the developing world when the UK held the presidency. Decisions of the Council, in most cases, are made on the basis of a qualified majority voting system. Under the Lisbon Treaty, most decisions of the Council require an affirmative vote of at least 55% of the member states. This threshold increases to 72% if acting on a proposal that did not originate in the Commission. Countries voting in favor of a proposal must also comprise at least 65% of the total EU population. Conversely, a blocking coalition, in addition to preventing one of the two conditions noted just now from occurring, must also include a minimum of 4 countries. The qualified majority voting system is intended to ensure that a coalition of small states cannot gang up and force their will on the more populous states, but also that a small group of large states cannot block the will of the entire body. On a handful of sensitive issues like tax policy, immigration, and common foreign and security policy, the Council still requires unanimity. In practice, the vast majority of the decisions by the Council are made on the basis of consensus without a formal vote ever taking place. So that concludes our brief overview of the key institutions of the European Union. Be sure to check out the other videos in this series, and thanks for watching, everyone. Have a good day. Bye.